Awesome. Great. Hi there. I see a few people trickling in here. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to get started in a few minutes once we have some more people join us today. Hello, thank you so much again. Thank you for joining us. Happy Thursday, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. Awesome. Thank you very much for joining us today. Happy Thursday again. Week is almost done, but I'm glad. Thanks everyone for joining. I know everyone's busy. We'll just get started in just a few seconds and get our presentation going here. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. So we're just at 2:02. So just to make sure that we get everything in today, we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. We have a few more people trickling in, and that's great. So happy to see everyone today. Thanks again for joining. So just to get started, so my name is Hannah Kaploon, pronouns she and her. I am the project coordinator at PLEAC. You may have seen me before in many of our PLEAC webinars. I'm located here in Toronto, Ontario. I'd like to acknowledge the land I and others joining us today are on, and it's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So November is National Indigenous Education Month. This month provides an opportunity to re-examine how Indigenous perspectives, histories, and contemporary realities may be centered across school curricula, and to focus on treaties and the legacy of residential schools. So the way forward to reconciliation requires ongoing self-reflection and deliberate action. So I do encourage everyone to read a little bit more about National Indigenous Education Month and apply some of these learnings to their everyday life as well. So thank you so much for joining us for PLEAC's webinar on achieving digital equity in a post-digital era, meeting the challenge. This webinar actually does come to you in two parts, but today you've joined us for part one, and part two will be taking place at the end of the month on November 25th, which I do encourage everyone to tune into as well. We have a panel of fantastic speakers today who will give us some insight into this topic, and they are Mary Basika and Alana Kendrick from the Centis Group. We have Kate Murray, AD Project Lead Researcher, and John Simpson, Lawyer and Manager of Community and Publishing Services at Legal Aid BC. So there's more bio details that were included in the registration process. So if you haven't checked it out, please do. I definitely recommend it. Everyone here is fantastic and has a lot of expertise to offer us today. So before I do pass it along to our great panel today, just to let you know, the session is being recorded. Everyone will receive the link to the recording after the webinar is done, and it will also be posted online. So just tune into that. There will also be a very brief survey at the end of the webinar as usual. So just take a minute out of your day if you can to complete it. This will help us continue to improve our programming, which is always appreciated. Finally, if you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A button or chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit those. The speakers will be answering any questions you may have at the end, but also feel free to chime in at any time. If it's relevant to the content at the moment, the speakers may chime in and address the question just at that time as well. So please feel free and don't be shy. And without further ado, I'll let our speakers take it away.
Well, I'll start. Thanks, Hannah. I appreciate the introduction. The panel today is coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in what is called British Columbia. And we're going to be talking about our Achieving Digital Equity project. This is a year-long project that is multifaceted. looked at the problem of digital exclusion for marginalized people from a number of perspectives, and engaged a number of contractors, including Centus and Agentic, another consulting company in British Columbia, as well as over 800 people across the province in various methods over the course of the year. The main message I get, and I suppose the big picture for this, is that despite the proliferation of communication devices, the expansion of the internet across British Columbia, as in other places, there's still many people, low-income, marginalized people, who do not have adequate access to information, legal information, and are able to use it effectively as a in a digital environment. And so that's the problem that led to the study. And what we're going to talk about today is what we learned about this in the course of the study, who is affected, and what steps we might take as PLEI providers to expand access and improve the situation for the disadvantaged. So with that introduction, I will pass it over to Kate for a lot more.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. As John mentioned, our project had a series of components. There's sort of 4 main components, and the project really, as John mentioned, really came from concerns that Legal Aid BC was hearing from its community networks. And so the 4 components of the project were a literature review, and that was a review of over 200 publications, as well as statistics on internet use, access barriers, and interventions. There was also a quantitative survey of BC residents, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that today. There was the 3rd component was a survey and some referrals tracking, and also focus groups with community workers and intermediaries across BC, as well as some interviews with low-income residents across BC. And that 3rd and 4th component we'll be focusing on in the next session. So we really hope you could join us for that. Today we're going to present some brief highlights from the first 2 components of our project. We're really going to focus on hearing about the quantitative survey, but also some supporting insights from the literature review. So I'll pass it over to Mary and Elena from Centus to hear about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. So just a little bit about the survey method to sort of give you a foundation of where all these stats are coming from that we're going to be sharing with you shortly. The methodology we used was a mail out survey. So we sent out an invitation letter, a paper survey, and a postage paid return envelope. And the invitation letter did have the option to do the survey online or call into our toll-free line to do it over the phone with an interviewer, excuse me. The impetus behind going with this methodology was because the study was about digital equity, it was really important that we came up with a methodology that was inclusive as possible, and a mail survey provided that platform. We mailed out to 5,000 BC households, and we sourced those lists from Canada Post, and we made use of their precision targeting tool, which allowed us to reach or have a greater probability of reaching lower income households, because that was the crux of the study. You can see there in blue that we received over 400 surveys back, and that's an 8% response rate. And you can see underneath that how many we got on paper versus online versus telephone. First, I'll address the response rate of 8%. That is actually exactly what we thought we'd get. And if I give you a point of comparison, back in the day when we used to do telephone surveying and we used to use telephone directories, we'd usually get about a 5 to 7% response rate. So 8% is even a little bit better than that. In terms of the surveys we got back, the paper surveys, that definitely had an age skew to it. Those who decided to respond on paper definitely were older, and among younger folks, they were more likely to go online or go by paper. So that was a bit more evenly distributed. Then just to make sure the results are reflective of the population of BC, we put some mathematical weights in by age, accordance with the population of household maintainers in BC. But that said, we really don't look at the results in this study by the total. We look at it by 3 groups, in particular, those who fall into lower income households. And we use a combination of household income and household size to determine that. And 225 of the surveys fell into what we call the lower income household group. And that actually also just happens to align quite closely with Legal Aid BC's cutoffs for CFC, CSA, and criminal early resolution cases. And then anyone who didn't make that cutoff was put into moderate high income, and that accounts for 186 surveys. Now that group in the middle, very low income, they are a subset of lower income. So that 165 is a subset of the 225. And for that group, we use the Government of Canada's low income cutoffs for 2020, and that happens to align quite closely with Legal Aid BC's cutoffs for standard and family limited representation cases. And that group, because they are considered very low income, they really do help to illustrate just some of the divides that there are between lower income and moderate to high income households, and just shine a better light on some of the results. And then finally, when it comes to Indigenous households, we heard from 6% of our sample fell into were Indigenous. That's 28 surveys, and among lower income households, that accounts for 10%, and very low income households accounts for 12%. So that takes care of all the sort of background administrative setup, and I'm going to turn it back to Kate, and she's going to introduce the first concept, which is first level divides.
Thank you, Mary. So the term digital divides that many of us are used to hearing usually refers to inequities in internet access. But really, in the literature, there is increasing discussion of more types of divides, and understanding this idea in a more complex way. So when we looked sort of at statistics in BC or in Canada overall, you know, you really do hear that there are high levels of internet use, but then when you look more closely, there really are some pretty considerable divides across the population. And so in the literature and also in our study, we really tried to understand the idea of access as a multidimensional thing. So it really depends on many factors. And we've listed a few on the slide here, things like the quality of people's service, affordability is huge. The location of access, how convenient that is for people. Are they just accessing in a library, etc.? How many devices do people have access to? And can they choose to use different devices for different activities? Because that can be really important in terms of your quality of internet experience. And then sort of continuity or interruptions in access. And certainly we've heard a lot about the impacts of intimate partner violence during the pandemic and how that has really negatively impacted access for a lot of people. In BC, affordability and data caps are really important, and urban and rural divides in access. And so this sort of tried to inform our thinking about how we asked about access in the survey that Mary and Alana will talk about.
Thanks, Kate. So we're going to start with looking at internet usage, and really we're just hoping to give you a little bit more of a foundation to that underpins a lot of the research that Kate and John did. And we'll start by looking at some of the fundamentals and the behaviors, internet usage being the first one. So you can see here that internet usage among lower income households and moderate to high income households is quite high. If I bring in that subset of very low income households, you can see it's also quite high at 87%. But where we start to see some differences is when we look at age. And I know that little call out just came popping up at the top, so maybe I'll better speak to that first. Census conducted Legal Aid BC's client survey in 2020, and we asked about internet usage, and 75% of those clients told us they had regular and reliable internet access, and that's a little lower than what you're seeing here on the screen, simply because that group disproportionately experiences things like economic issues, housing issues, and other challenges. So that's probably why that 75% is a little bit lower, but it does give you a bit of context. But as I said, where we start to see some differences is when we look at by age. You can see among lower income households, internet usage starts high with the under 45s, but then decreases to 81% among seniors. We don't see that same pattern among the moderate to high income households. It's pretty high across the age bands. If we swap that out for Indigenous lower income households, you can see their internet usage is a little bit lower than non-lower income Indigenous households, 81% versus 92%. So another part of first level divides is just what devices you have and whether or not you have internet on those devices. You can see here that aside from cell phones, which is cell phone for personal use is fairly high among lower and moderate to high income households, then you start to see more differences, especially when you get into things like tablets and iPads and printers or scanners. Moderate to high income households are considerably more likely to have those devices than lower income households. And if I bring in that subset of very low income households, you just see how much more pronounced that pattern becomes. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlay access on those devices. And you can see here that for the most part, when you're in a moderate to high income household and you have these devices such as laptops, computers, mobile phones, you're very likely to have internet on those devices. However, that's not necessarily the case in lower and very low income households where you might have the device, but then now you don't have a way to access the internet on them. So just bringing in some Indigenous results. So among lower income households, the numbers you're seeing here are the proportion who have the device and have internet access on those devices. And aside from laptops and computers where we don't see much difference, we definitely see a difference in terms of internet access when it comes to cell phones and tablets and iPads. And again, just ownership of a printer scanner is considerably lower among Indigenous lower income households than non. So turning to the activities that individuals do online when they're on the internet, topping the list is emailing, and you can see that's fairly widespread among lower income households, the teal bar, and moderate to high income households, the gray bar at the top. And if you look at that call out on the right, one area where we do see some differences is among age. So among lower income households, email usage is definitely steps down with age, and you can see when it gets to the 65 pluses, we're now at 78%. So it is a little bit lower. But as we go into these other activities that are done online, we start to see more of a difference between moderate to high and lower income households. And I'm going to bring in a few delta symbols just to highlight the areas where there's the greatest difference between the two income bands. So online banking, filling out government forms, shopping, and video voice calls. That's where we see the greatest difference between lower income households using the internet for these activities and moderate to high. Okay, everybody's still with me, I hope. So still on first level divides, we're going to talk about some of the barriers that people face using the internet or using it more often than they'd like to. So you can see right away that lower income households tend to face more barriers, or a greater proportion of them face barriers than moderate to high income households. That's pretty apparent just by the pies there. And then if I bring in that subset of very low income households, again, you see that pattern is even more pronounced, with over half saying, yeah, I face a barrier. There's something that's stopping me from using the internet or using it more frequently than I'd like to. Again, age is quite a revealing breakdown. So among lower income households, you can see that as age goes up, those barriers increase, and actually quite significantly, from 29 to 40 to 59% of those 65 and over. So 6 in 10 saying, yeah, I face some sort of barrier to using the internet. Among moderate to high income households, a similar pattern, but not nearly as predominant. It just, when we get to the 65 plus, only 20% or 2 in 10 say, yeah, I face a barrier to using the internet. So it's quite stark. So let's just swap that out for a second and look at Indigenous households. Among lower income households, Indigenous lower income households much more likely to face barriers than their non-Indigenous counterparts. So let's unpack this a little bit more. And the first question is, well, what kind of barriers are they facing? So if you read from left to right, you can see that access barriers top the list, followed by digital skill, then all the way down to learning, literacy, language barriers. And those proportions might not look too high, but when we bring in the moderate to high income households, you can see that among lower income households, these barriers are 2, 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 times higher among lower income households. If we unpack a few of these a little bit more, you can see that on access barriers, it really is cost that tops the list. It's just too expensive. Like I can't pay that bill, or I can't have Wi-Fi. And then when it comes to health disability, you can see that mental health and both physical health issues are coming into play there. And then again, just swapping out for some statistics on lower income Indigenous households, much more likely to face access and digital skill barriers than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Okay, hopefully everyone's still following. And I'm now going to actually turn it back to Kate, and she's going to talk about second level divides.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, so the idea of a second level digital divide really sort of refers to people's skill and comfort and experience with technology, and some of the things that that Mary has already touched upon that can really act as barriers. And so once again, and this is one of the things that actually really surprised me when I started looking into the statistics on this topic, there really is a considerable variation in levels of experience and skill across the population. And I think something that's really, really important to keep in mind here is that lower levels of digital skill or experience or comfort really result from people having had fewer opportunities to access, use, and benefit from technology. And so things like access and educational and workplace opportunities are really, really important in this area. So things like, did you have the opportunity, pre-retirement opportunity to use computers on a daily basis at work? And so we really see differences here that are class-based differences in terms of, people who held professional roles where they were every day working on a computer in supported situations are going to have really different levels of experience and skill. People, and we've touched on this a little bit already, people tend to have online repertoires or activities that they're used to doing online. So digital experience really not only varies sort of across the population, but also by activity. And another thing that we looked at in this area is just digital design and content. And it's important to sort of remember that these things also really play a role in terms of people's interest and ability and likelihood to engage with resources. So if things aren't well designed, or we also know that there can be a lot of problematic content online in terms of content that's not accessible or culturally safe or relevant. And so these things are also sort of part of what could be considered a second level digital divide. And I'll pass things back to Mary and Alana.
Thanks, Kate. So we're going to start by looking at confidence with technology. And so a lot of the survey results that we're going to cover in second level divide, so this next section that I'm going to speak to, really are more attitudinal rather than behavioral. So it's not whether or not I have access, it's how I feel about using the internet. So one of the first questions we asked in the survey was, well, how would you rate your confidence with technology? And they gave us a rating out of 10. So 10 was, I'm extremely confident, all the way down to 1 with, I'm not at all confident. You can see there in the stacked bar chart that among lower income households, 59%, so about 6 in 10, tell us that, yeah, I'm fairly confident. So they gave themselves a rating of 7 out of 10. But when we compare that to moderate to high income households, you can see there's quite a stark difference where we have over 80% in moderate to high income households feeling confident with technology. Again, if we bring in that subset of very low income households, that difference between moderate to high income households or against moderate to high income households is even greater, with only half saying that they feel confident with technology. We can unpack this a little bit, especially among lower income households. If we look at the results of those ratings 7 out of 10 among some of the subgroups. So right away, you can see that by age, confidence goes down as age goes up, all the way down to only 37% of lower income individuals who are 65 and over feeling confident with technology. We also see a difference with Indigenous households. Only 40% of those in lower income Indigenous households feel confident with technology versus 64 in non-Indigenous households. So we also got at this another way. It's a similar question, but a little different. We asked the respondents, if you received a new electronic device, would you need help from others to set it up or have them show you how to use it? And so you can see with the stacked bar chart there that just over half, 53% of lower income households said, yes, I always or sometimes need that kind of help. Someone to help me help me know how to use or show me how to use this new device. Again, bringing in the moderate to high income households, only 37% say they need that kind of help. And again, if we bring in the very low income households, we just see a more pronounced pattern with them, even more, about 58% needing that help. We can unpack this a bit as well. Again, if we're showing the proportion among lower income households who say always or sometimes, we see some of the same patterns, but now we see a difference between men and women more often needing help. We see that urban-rural divide. We see an opposite pattern with the Indigenous households, which I think just has to do with sample size because the Indigenous household sample size is a bit small. So if we take those two questions, and that's what you're seeing here on the screen, and we again show the results by age. So on the left, you're seeing that proportion that gave a 7 out of 10 rating. They're saying, yes, I'm confident with technology. And on the right, you're seeing that question about, I need help when I have a new electronic device. And this is the proportion saying I always need help. It's clear that among both lower income and moderate to high income households, there's an age difference. The older you are, the less confident you are with technology. However, you can see how much higher that need for help with a new electronic device is among all the age groups in lower income households compared to moderate income households, and how that level of confidence with technology across all the age groups compared to the moderate income households in the same age group is just lower. And so that's just reinforcing the message that it is, even though age is playing a role, income is also playing a dominant role in what's going on. So that's just sort of hitting that nail on the head just one more time. So there was another set of questions in the survey where individuals could do a self-rating of how they felt about their perceptions of using the internet. So we had 5 statements, and for each one, they could rate themselves as high, moderate, or low when it came to accessing the internet, interest in using it for things they might have previously done in other ways, their skill, their confidence in finding trustworthy information, and their trust in entering personal information online. So the proportions you're seeing here are those who say, I have a high level of access. I feel I have a high level of interest. I feel like I have a high level of skill, confidence, trust, etc. And again, we see a marked difference between those in lower versus moderate to high income households when it comes to just their positive perceptions about using the internet. Where we don't see as much of a difference is when it comes to personal trust in entering personal information online. And we're going to unpack that a bit in the next slide. But before we do that, I'm just going to bring in the very low income subset just to again reinforce that when we get into those very low income households, there's just even more of a disparity between their self-rating in terms of using the internet versus moderate to high income households. So as I said, trust, if we look at lower versus moderate to high income households, it seems that they both don't have a particularly high level of trust in entering personal information online. So let's look at the full distribution of that for the three categories. And what stands out here is just that among lower income households, and especially very low income households, there's a very large portion that have a very low level of trust when it comes to entering personal information online. They're worried about it. That's also the case a little bit for moderate to high income households, but just not to the same extent. So this is now just another component that builds on the whole digital equity challenge with lower income households. So those same 5 statements, access, trust, etc., we also asked it in the context of COVID. In other words, do you feel that your perception of the internet has, on any given one of these aspects, has increased, decreased, or not changed because of COVID? And what we found was the most common response is that COVID didn't really impact internet use or perceptions across all the income groups. However, those in lower income households did report more impacts due to COVID compared to moderate to high income households. And 2 areas stood out, and I'm going to put those 2 on the screen. So that interest in using the internet for things you previously did in other ways, whether you did it in person or by phone. Here you can see that among moderate to high income households, you had about 4 in 10 that said, yes, I've actually, my interest has increased in doing things online now since COVID. And I think many of us can relate to that. However, that's only true for 1/3 of lower income households. Again, when we talk about that trust in entering personal information online, a large majority of moderate to high income households, that 81%, said COVID didn't really affect anything on that front for them. But when we look at lower income households, it actually decreased their trust for 24%, which is almost double the amount in moderate to high income households. So finally, back over to Kate. She's going to talk about 3rd level divides.
Yeah, so also obviously in our study, we not only looked at digital divides, but we also really wanted to think about how this plays out specifically in context of legal help seeking and thinking about PLEI resources and access to justice. So the literature that we looked at here also highlights, a lot of challenges relating to access to justice and PLEI, and those will be challenges that many of you will be familiar with. And the ways that I think we've started to think about this in the study is really just to focus on how digital equity issues, but also access to justice issues can kind of combine to create a double set of barriers for some people who are impacted by both those sets of barriers. So they're each important sets of barriers in their own right, but then when you sort of combine them in terms of trying to find legal help online, you're actually looking at 2 sets of barriers that are compounding one another. And obviously these barriers are increased for people who have faced systemic oppression and discrimination, and who really lack confidence both in legal systems or in their own ability to access help within legal systems because of those things. One of the pieces that came up here relates to challenges associated with online search environments and how difficult it can be to navigate, the huge amounts of legal information that are there online, some of which may or may not be relevant. And also the effects of stress and trauma really emerged in the literature, and then, as we'll discuss more in our next session, really emerged as a strong theme in our study overall. how it can be so difficult to navigate and use legal information when you're experiencing stress and trauma and overwhelm. And obviously, literacy, language, and other barriers play a role in terms of navigating legal information online as well. And so another interesting theme that emerged strongly in the literature and overall is actually that using digital legal resources alongside help from an advisor or a helper significantly improves satisfaction and outcomes in using those resources. So that was a really important theme that emerged in the literature and that we subsequently explored in other parts of the research. So, okay, back over to Mary and Alana.
Thanks, Kate. So one of the questions we posed in the survey was, imagine you had a legal issue or problem that you needed help with. How much do you agree or disagree that you would? And then we had 8 statements. And the first one was, still want help from a person or advisor, even if you were still going to go online and do some searching. And you can see from those top 2 bars that doesn't matter if you're in a lower income household or a moderate to high income household, most people still want help from a person, even if they are going to go online and look for legal information. Similarly, searching online really depends on my legal issue. Both lower income households and moderate to high income households agree on that point. But then when we start to look at some of the other attitudes towards seeking legal information online, things start to pull apart more. And I'm going to throw in a few deltas again, just to highlight 2 in particular. The first thing I would do is search online. You can see that that's true for almost 9 in 10 moderate to high income households, but only 2/3 of lower income households say they would do that first. So that wouldn't be their first go-to. Secondly, it would be too confusing or overwhelming to search online. Just over a half of lower income households agreed with that. Well, that was the case for only a third of moderate to high income households. Just to bring in some results on the lower income Indigenous households, we found that they were less likely to agree to these statements across the board. They seemed more hesitant in general, and that came up with a larger proportion of them just saying they didn't know to each of these statements, anywhere from a quarter to 30%, just not able to provide any feedback. So lastly, we provided a laundry list of different legal issues to respondents in the survey, and we asked them, which ones would you be most confident or comfortable going online to get help with? And you can see there in the top corner that the top 3 were consumer issues, employment issues, and welfare social assistance issues. Now I'm going to put the whole gamut, all 13 on the screen for you. And what becomes apparent really quickly, once again, is that the comfort and confidence level among moderate to high income households in terms of going online to get help with these legal issues is much higher for that group than it is among the lower income households. And again, I'll throw some deltas on the screen to help highlight those areas where the difference between moderate to high and lower income households is most marked. And you can see that consumer issues, housing or land, family, money or debt, immigration and discrimination issues are where lower income households are just more reluctant. They're just not confident or not comfortable getting help on those things if in a legal sense from online resources. So just throwing a few things on the screen all at once for you. Census has done several other studies for Legal Aid BC across the past year and a bit. And all those studies had components that touch on digital equity. And we did see a few common threads. So we're just putting those on the screen to share with you. We did some community dialogues with community partners and clients. That was all qualitative research. And that message of balancing online services with a human touch came out very strongly in that research. The client survey that we do every other year for Legal Aid BC also asks about Legal Aid BC's online resources. And you can see there in the middle panel that having more help understanding the law, offering an online chat, and just getting assistance from staff to navigate the websites are the top asks. And then lastly, we've done several waves of an everyday legal needs survey, which is among low-income BC residents for Legal Aid BC. And what the last wave has told us, because we have some nice tracking data on that, is that lower income individuals are experiencing more and more types of legal issues than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. Consumer and employment issues are currently topping the list. And even though these legal problems are mounting, we still have a significant proportion that don't have sufficient access. They don't have the confidence or the comfort to use the internet to address them. So these are all things that we saw in other studies that definitely came out in this study specifically. So back to Kate to round things off.
Thank you. And I noticed we did have a question there about trust, but maybe we'll make sure we come back to that in the question period afterwards. So just to let you know, we haven't missed that. So in the literature review, we also tried to look for sort of promising interventions that might address this very broad array of barriers that we've tried to look at in our research. And obviously, when it comes to digital divides and connectivity and affordability issues, there's really a need for broad public policy interventions relating to technology, infrastructure, and affordability. And these interventions obviously extend beyond the mandate of PLEI providers themselves. But there is a theme sort of emerging that indicates public legal sector organizations might have a role to play in increasing sort of community-based access to technology. Insofar as they can provide service locations that do enable supported access to technology. Another sort of area of intervention is really at the community level. And so the literature talks about digital ecosystems and enabling environments that support people to use technology. And these, one theme that emerges strongly here is that these things really need to be considered sort of on a community by community basis, because communities are different and there's different things going on there. And so one idea that emerged there that I thought was really interesting was the idea of digital equity coalitions that could be formed sort of in different communities where different groups who are working on the issue or impacted by the issue could sort of come together to do some community-based planning and advocacy around that. And also, obviously, outreach and integration and working really strongly with intermediaries was another key theme that emerged in terms of outreach with respect to digital legal resources. And also, as I mentioned in terms of challenges related to search environments. And we'll talk about this a lot more in the next session, but online discoverability and search engine optimization, that kind of thing is, I think, becoming increasingly important. And it is a real challenge, I think, for PLEI providers to sort of be able to manage search engines and search engine results in terms of helping people to find digital legal resources. Digital design and content, there's obviously a whole set of quite technical interventions there that are really important. And so I think that's sort of its own body of work that is also really important, that we didn't dig into too much in the literature review, just because it is sort of such a big and specialized area. And then finally, an overarching theme that's emerged, and I sort of touched on this earlier, is just the importance of having offline options for people, as well as access to complementary types of support, and especially one-to-one help. Either one-to-one help in using resources or other kinds of one-to-one help with legal issues. And this could really vary in terms of the level of intensivity. Some people will need very intensive legal help, as you all know, but sometimes someone will just need a way of checking in to say, is this the right information to put in this form, or I just want to make sure I filled out the form correctly, or I've used this tool correctly. And so there's a real array of kinds of supports that are emerging there. And so I think at the very basic level, this research is just cautioning against digital only approaches, and is really just emphasizing the need for multiple kinds of channels, and realizing that, you know, as John mentioned at the beginning, it's really not feasible to move to sort of digital only service delivery or resource delivery without excluding a pretty considerable part of the population. So I think that finishes all I have for that slide. And I don't know, John, do you want to sort of speak a little bit?
Yeah, I just had a couple of things. First of all, thanks to Mary and Alana and Kate for the presentations. It's great to do this again, and looking forward to the next one with Agentic. And I just wanted to make a comment about this. We've known for, of course, a long time that people face challenges with using digital resources and digital tools. What is concerning about the situation now is that I think the evolution of access and usability has reached a pretty much steady state. You can see it with the saturation of mobile devices in homes. 90+% of all homes in BC have at least one mobile device. However, what the research shows is that there is this persistent group of low income and particularly very low income households that do not have access and will need assistance to use resources. And more, I know other PLEI organizations in Canada talk about navigators, court navigators, justice navigators. I'm seeing that expression come up internationally now, increasingly, describing a role where the person isn't a lawyer, isn't a paralegal, isn't an advocate, but is helping the person to find the information they need to take the next step. And clearly, we're not at a stage, and we will never be, in my opinion, where you won't need that role, even for the people who may not need an advocate or a lawyer to take that next step. I'm looking forward to the next session. I hope you can come back for that as well. I think the project has been quite enlightening about the current status. At Legal Aid BC, we have been taking a variety of steps over the years to address these issues. Our community partners are essentially justice navigators. We have legal information outreach workers, Aboriginal community legal workers, all of whom provide information in addition to other services. And of course, we have chat. We have all the tools that you think are going to meet this need. But I think the message I get from this research is that we're still not meeting that need adequately, and we need to do more. So it's important to bear that in mind when we're thinking about digital access, digital equity, who's excluded and why, what can be done about it. And that's about all I have to say. If there are any questions, we have any time, Hannah?
Yeah, for sure. There's absolutely some time here. And Kate mentioned that we did have that question in the Q&A. I'll just read it out loud. Anyone can kind of chime in to address it. But regarding the low trust in entering personal information online, curious how this was asked. Was this related to online intake form for legal services, court forms? Some have made the experience better. Did you look at what kind of forms they're talking about?
The question in the survey about trust, I think I'm talking about the right one, was asked generally, and it wasn't necessarily asked in the context of legal information. I'm just trying to look at the survey. So
I can chime in, Mary, on this.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, Alana, because you've got
no problem. So we had a few questions that were specific to legal aid, but this wasn't one of them. That was more in relation to the types of legal problems and whether you'd be interested in going online for help with them. But when it comes to the trust, it was just a general, how would you rate the following, your trust in entering personal information on the internet? And it was high, moderate, or low. Yeah, so it didn't really dig into the types of forms or types of information, that kind of thing.
And I do think this question, though, has really picked up on an important angle that we didn't, I think we were quite constrained in terms of the number of questions and the length of the questions we could ask, because we were trying to ensure could fit it all on paper and only a few pieces of paper. So, but I think, thinking a little bit about what some of the things that was said in the interviews, which were another component of the studies, people really are a bit more are more nuanced, obviously, in terms of the way they make these decisions. So they're, I think it's useful to think about overall levels of trust, but also people, I think in those interviews, people sort of indicated that they make kind of different, they make different decisions, obviously, about the kinds of information they share, whether they're thinking about Facebook or whether they're thinking about typing information into a form, and who is, who's going to see this form, and do they trust the organization whose form it is. So absolutely, it is really important to sort of think about that concept of trust in a more nuanced way. And I think it's interesting, a lot of the community workers, and again, we'll talk about this next week, but they were sort of saying, well, we don't, like, trust emerged quite strongly as a barrier in this survey that we've just talked about today, I think. But then when we asked community workers, they were sort of saying, well, no, my clients actually don't bring up the issue of trust. They don't seem very concerned. And that could be because there is a level of trust that they have with intermediaries, that if the intermediary is saying, look, here's the form, please fill it out, then people are less worried about maybe entering that information on that form, because there is that person that helps them to trust the resource. And so I think that there's that might be an insight into the importance of that relationship-based help. So anyway, so I do think it is important to sort of think about this in a nuanced way, but again, because of sort of constraints in this survey, we were only able to do that sort of general level, which is still produced some really interesting results. So that's something maybe to note for further thinking and research. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for answering to that. And we did, thank you. Thanks, Desi, for answering that. And we did have some nice feedback in the chat from Joel as well. Thank you very much for that comment. And I see, Patricia, you do have your hand up. Feel free to use the Q&A or the chat to go ahead and drop your question if you have one, unless it was an accident. But otherwise, I do have another question here, actually. I think on the slide for barriers, can you talk more about the mental health barrier? This seems to be a big category. What do those barriers look like? And are those stats age specific as well?
Well, yes, mental health barriers are just as predominant, if not more predominant, than physical barriers when it comes to using the internet. And I can see Alana looking at her screen. We never really looked into any age skew on that, but I think Alana's trying to bring that up right now while I'm talking. I know from other research we've done for Legal Aid BC that, and Kate touched on this as well, is that people's mental state plays so strongly into using the internet, and just being able to actually take that step to actually go online and then digest what you're seeing when you're in perhaps a legal situation that is stressful, and you're worrying about custody issues and other such big issues. Trying to figure out how to use a form, or even just how to navigate to a form, sometimes just seems insurmountable. And so and that probably crosses I would think all age groups. But Alana, do you see anything there?
Yeah, so I pulled up looking at the health barriers by age, and when it comes to the emotional or mental health barriers, it's 15% among those under 45 say that is a barrier for them. And this is talking about those lower income households. Drops to 12% among those 45 to 64, and it's actually lower, only 6% among those 65 plus. But then it's kind of the opposite when you look at the physical barriers. So 5% among the lower age groups, and then up to 8% among those 65 and older.
So whoever asked the question, you're very astute, because it looks like there is a higher level of mental health barriers as age goes down, and more physical health barriers as age goes up.
Awesome. That's very interesting. Thank you so much. And I just want to address as well, Patricia chimed in the Q&A here just about trust again in the survey. So what is meant by trust? Trust of the people developing the digital resource, i.e. are they reliable? Trust that online information won't be hacked, used, or divulged. I don't know if there's any more information you can provide on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, as we said, it really was asked in a general sense, and it was just trust in entering your personal information online. So we didn't actually put any other parameters on it specifically. And unfortunately, we don't have any other, at least in the quantitative study, any other information or open-ended questions where we can try to mine some more information on that, but Kate might be able to further elaborate on that from her other research components.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing that I could sort of really say, either sort of from the literature or from those the interviews that we did, is that yeah, people, it's hard to say what people were sort of thinking of when we asked about trust in entering personal information. I think people are quite concerned about banking information. So that was something that came up commonly, both sort of in the interviews and in the literature, that people would say, well, I would never put my financial information online. You know, people who had concerns. But yeah, unfortunately, we weren't able to get into the asking about more specific sorts of legal tasks online. So I think that might be again a conversation to have a little more with community workers or advocates or folks who are sort of client-facing staff who are sort of able to or to ask, you know, people more specifically in the future about what kinds of information might be more concerning, or what types of activities they'd have more or fewer concerns with.
Okay, great. And just because we have a few minutes left, I'll see if we can touch on one more question here. So Kate, can you expand on what you mean by digital ecosystem? You gave an example on digital equity coalitions, but can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. And I guess this is just sort of thinking about these issues on a community by community basis. But also, I think one of the themes that was sort of coming up in the literature was just, you know, often when you do hear discussions about this or other kinds of surveys on this topic, it really tends to be a fairly individualized focus in terms of, you know, sort of locating like lack of skill sort of within a person, as opposed to recognizing that is really a product of someone's opportunities, which are, you know, very much classed opportunities and impacted by all sorts of other dynamics. And so the idea of digital ecosystems tries to sort of look at the ways that environments and communities can either support people to be online and to learn and to use and to benefit and have access to technology, or in contrast, how people can be, you know, lacking in opportunity because of the environment they're in. So it really sort of, you know, thinks about all those environmental and sort of structural factors. So things like, do they have access to digital skills, free digital skills and supported learning opportunities in their community? Are people who live alone and seniors who live alone or who have mobility issues, are they supported to have access to technology, have access to technical support? And so it's really trying to think about the issue in that sort of environmental and systemic way, as opposed to sort of locating the barrier within individuals. So yeah, and there's an interesting report, if you do look at the literature review, there's an interesting report out of the States, and I'm completely blanking on the authors' names right now, but I can follow up on that really talks about a bunch of initiatives that were happening, especially in the context of COVID, where organizations, digital equity organizations, but other kind of service provider organizations were coming coming together to work together on these issues and identify gaps in the communities and access funding. And we're really trying to do this sort of on a community basis. And in some cases, municipal governments were involved and sort of trying to address a lot of these environmental and access-based issues. So that's an interesting sort of report to look at for a bit more information on that topic. And I will try to get back with the authors' names there.
Thank you, Kate.
Because-
Absolutely. And I'm happy to, oh, sorry, John, I was going to say, I'm happy to circulate that as well afterwards once we have it. But John, do you want to chime in?
Oh, I was just going to say, it's a very complex issue at a community level. I remember the issue around last mile access. There are many communities where you'll see a pin on a map saying they have high-speed internet, but the high-speed internet goes to the band office or the local medical clinic and not to the homes. And then that becomes an enormous barrier. So as you can tell from the presentation today, it's multifaceted, that there's all kinds of aspects to it that you need to address in one way or another in order to ensure everyone has access.
Absolutely. And I do want to chime in by saying thank you to some of the feedback in the chat here. I really appreciate it. And because we are at 3 o'clock here, I do want to sort of wrap up and say thank you so much to Mary, Atlanta, Kate, and John, our fantastic speakers today. Thank you for such an insightful presentation. Of course, we are excited for part 2 to hear a little bit more from everyone as well as Agentis. So as mentioned before, the link to the webinar recording will be made available to everyone shortly, and any other maybe links or resources that our group here is willing to share. If you're interested in connecting with anyone here as well, please feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to connect you as well. If there's any other questions we didn't get to, thanks for those who did submit today. And we look forward to seeing everyone at part 2 on November 25th. You will receive the registration and any reminders by email soon as well. Yet again, thanks for the feedback and thanks for tuning in today. And again, thanks to our speakers. We'll see everyone again soon and have a lovely weekend. Bye, everyone.